Let's break down our top waiver wire additions at every single position as we move into week 6 of the fantasy season. All right, let's kick the video off with Rico Dowdle of the Carolina Panthers, coming off of a monstrous week 5 performance. 32.4 fantasy points at home against the Dolphins, 206 rushing yards, a rushing touchdown, and added 3 catches for 28 receiving yards. And you just absolutely have to try and go add Rico Dowdle. I know he's sitting around 71% rostered, so maybe difficult, but if he's still out there floating on waivers, he needs to be a priority add moving into week 6. Now let's just go ahead and address the elephant in the room. Chuba Hubbard could play in week 6, dealing with that calf injury. He's been labeled day to day. We don't know exactly if he's going to be ready for week 6 or not, what his availability is looking like. But in week 6, the Panthers are going to be at home again, facing the Dallas Cowboys, an exceptionally awful run defense, giving up a ton of fantasy points to opposing running backs. So you gotta like this week 6 matchup. Then the following week, they're on the road, but they get the Jets, another soft run defense. So if Dowdle is in line for RB1 work the next 2 weeks, he is going to be a startable running back. He might not have 32 fantasy points, but he can easily get you guys in the double-digit range over the next 2 weeks, especially at home in week 6 if Chuba Hubbard is out in week 6. And I have talked about Rico Dowdle quite a few times early in the season as a really strong handcuff. If you guys were struggling at the running back position, we knew based on what Rico Dowdle did last year, if Chuba was to miss time, that Dowdle could come in and play as an RB1. And I do believe that there is still a circumstance here when Chuba does return to action that maybe Dowdle has carved out enough of a role that based on softer matchups, we can still start Rico Dowdle at times in terms of standalone value as an RB2 on this team. So Dowdle, pretty highly rostered, but if he's out there and available, especially if you're thin at the running back position, needs to be a priority waiver wire addition as we move into week 6 of the season. But along, let's talk about Michael Carter of the Arizona Cardinals, coming off of a very solid fantasy day in week 5 at home against the Titans. 18.3 fantasy points, 51 yards on the ground, had a rushing touchdown and added 5 catches for 22 receiving yards, has moved up to about 59% rostered, but what we do know here is that Trey Benson is on IR, so he's going to miss at least the next 3 games. Bam Knight got a little bit of involvement, did score a touchdown, but only 5 total touches for him. Then I'm just going to go ahead and guess that Amari DeMarcado is in the doghouse after he had the fumble, drop the football, whatever you want to call it, at the inch yard line or whatever. I mean, I had kind of had this thesis that DeMarcado was going to get some work here in week 5 all week long. And I mean, even if he had scored that big touchdown, he didn't really get a lot of work, just 3 touches in this game. But obviously the big run that should have been a touchdown could have, at least kept him in the mix here. I'm not saying he's going to be completely exiled out of this maybe potential committee for the Cardinals, but it's not looking bright. And ultimately that really just leaves Michael Carter. And once again, like guys like Bam Knight and DeMarcado who got involved in week 5. I mean, this was against a really soft Titans run defense in a game script where initially the Cardinals were playing way up ahead on the Titans until the second half of that game, right, where the Titans came back and won the football game. But still, Michael Carter wasn't necessarily needed, and it made sense for RB2s, RB3s like Bam Knight and DeMarcado to get involvement. But in week 6, a much tougher matchup on the road against the Indianapolis Colts. Week 7, an even tougher matchup against the Green Bay Packers, and then get a week 8 bye week. And then at that point, week 9 is a good matchup against the Cowboys, but Trey Benson will be eligible to return. Only time will tell when he does come back. But for the time being, if Michael Carter's out there and available, he is still looking at RB1 volume. Even in 2 tougher matchups, at least the game script should benefit Carter over the next 2 weeks, and we could maybe see a little bit less of guys like Bam Knight and Amari DeMarcado over the next 2 weeks or so. So if you're hurting at the running back position, I do believe moving into week 6, Michael Carter is a priority waiver wire add at the running back position. Moving along to some wide receivers, let's talk about Romeo Doubs of the Green Bay Packers, who was on bye week in week 5, but let's not forget had 29.8 fantasy points in week 4 against the Cowboys, 8 targets, 6 catches, and a whopping 3 touchdowns, in around 63% rostered, so still relatively highly rostered, but is one of these players who may have gotten dropped or may have been gotten forgotten about on the waiver wire because he was on bye week in week 5, and here in week 6, he gets the Cincinnati Bengals, a very, very strong matchup. We kind of look at the overall breakdown here, going off of week 4, right? Matthew Golden had 6 targets. Dontayvon Wicks had 4 targets. We might as well mention Tucker Kraft, who had 5 targets in that game. Romeo Doubs, 8 targets, led the team in total targets in week 4. And I don't really think that's going to change at home, coming off of a bye week, going up against a defense that allows a tremendous amount of fantasy points kind of across the board, but to the wide receiver position as well. They've been really soft in their last 2 matchups, and Romeo Doubs should come out and get wide receiver 1 volume in week 6, even if we see some sprinkles of other guys like Tucker Kraft at the tight end position, as the Bengals are really poor against tight ends, or maybe we see more Matthew Golden. I still like Romeo Doubs a lot here in week 6, and he may have gotten dropped, might be out there floating because the Packers were on bye week in week 5. So if you guys need a wide receiver to play in week 6, gotta like Romeo Doubs, coming off of a 3 touchdown performance and getting the Cincinnati Bengals here in week 6. Next up, I want to mention Kendrick Bourne of the San Francisco 49ers, coming off of a very strong Thursday night football performance with 24.2 fantasy points, 11 targets, 10 receptions, 142 receiving yards in that win over the Rams in week 5. Now, there's a couple elephants in the room here. We don't know who the starting quarterback for the Niners will be in week 6, but I think it's going to end up being Mac Jones, which I think benefits Kendrick Bourne because apparently these two have some sort of chemistry, right? Maybe from their days back with the New England Patriots. But I do think that this is a good thing. I don't think Purdy would be necessarily a bad thing, but Mac Jones, Kendrick Bourne might be a real thing. And then we have the Ricky Pearsall question mark, and we have the Jawan Jennings question mark. Ricky Pearsall dealing with a knee injury, Jawan Jennings dealing with 2 separate injuries, an ankle and a rib injury. So don't know their status for week 6. Obviously, if they're both out, that's going to help Kendrick Bourne exponentially in terms of his potential fantasy output. If one of the 2 wide receivers there is out, then that also is going to still help Kendrick Bourne look at wide receiver 1 type volume that he saw in week 5 against the Rams. And this is a good matchup on the road against the Buccaneers, not the strongest secondary, but also one of these game scripts where the Niners are going to be forced to throw the football, because we know at the end of the day, until the 4th quarter ends, the Bucs are going to do whatever they can to put up points. So Kendrick Bourne could be a sneaky ad here in week 6. He's very lowly rostered. If you guys are in need of a desperation play, pay attention to the quarterback situation here. Pay attention to the wide receiver situation for the Niners. But I do think that Kendrick Bourne could be a sneaky upside ad here in week 6 of the season. All right, let's take a look at some quarterbacks, and I want to talk about Matthew Stafford. I mean, he's sitting around 61% rostered, but had 25.5 fantasy points in week 5, 30 of 47, 389 passing yards, and 3 passing touchdowns. And don't forget, in week 4, 27.4 fantasy points, 3 passing touchdowns, 375 passing yards. He is playing absolutely lights out. I mean, he's had 18 or more fantasy points in 3 out of the first 5 games on the season. And here in week 6, he is getting this completely derailed Ravens defense. I mean, even on the road here, it doesn't really concern me. CJ Stroud just absolutely tore up this Ravens defense and threw 4 touchdowns on them. I don't see any reason why in week 6, Matthew Stafford can't come out and throw for over 350 passing yards and 3 passing touchdowns like he's done the last 2 weeks of the season. So really safe floor here in week 6 for Stafford if you guys are in need of a streaming quarterback or just having issues at the quarterback position in general, and he's out there floating on waivers. But also I think that the upside is absolutely here because his Ravens defense has just been flat out bad to start the year, and they also are dealing with a ton of injuries. So if Stafford's out there and available, I think he's definitely a quarterback that you guys can go add and have confidence in off of the waivers going into week 6. All right, if you guys need a quarterback a little bit lower roster, let's talk about Tua Tagovailoa of the Miami Dolphins, sitting around 29% roster, 22 fantasy points in week 5, 256 passing yards, 3 passing touchdowns. He has now thrown at least 2 passing touchdowns in every game since week 2 of the season. You don't always get the highest ceilings necessarily out of Tua, but I do think that he can bring in a pretty safe floor at times. It can be difficult to trust him, don't get me wrong, and I mean, in kind of surprising fashion, the Dolphins offense looked better without Tyreek Hill in week 5. Maybe to some people that's not surprising, but I mean, come on, Tyreek Hill, still had plenty of talent left in the tank before the injury. And, believe it or not, I mean, the Panthers have been a pretty solid defense in terms of fantasy points allowed. So it's not like this was just a layup of a matchup in week 5 on the road against the Panthers. And they're at home in week 6 against a Chargers team that looked pretty bruised and battered against the Washington Commanders in week 5, was not impressed with their defense in week 5. So I think that this is actually a pretty decent spot for the Dolphins for Tua time here in week 6. Pretty lowly roster quarterback if you guys are struggling at the position. Got a couple of teams on bye week here in week 6. Tua could be a streamer, could help you guys pull through and get a victory in week 6 of the fantasy season. Moving to the tight end position, let's talk about Mason Taylor of the New York Jets. 17.7 fantasy points against the Cowboys in week 5. 12 targets, 9 catches, 67 receiving yards. If you guys watched our stash video this past week, we talked about Mason Taylor as a potential option for you guys' benches and maybe as a potential starter moving forward as well. And what we really want to look at here is still, when you break down this Jets offensive roster, they are missing a primary pass catcher outside of Garrett Wilson, right? Breece Hall, 5 targets, 4 catches. We got to talk about running backs in the mix here. That's how bad it is. The wide receiver position, Josh Reynolds, 4 targets, 3 catches. And then we kind of look across the board. I mean, there's barely any involvement. 2 targets, 1 catch to Allen Lazard. Tyler Johnson didn't even play this past week. I mean, there's just nobody at the wide receiver position outside of Garrett Wilson. They need pass catchers on this team to step up. This is part of the logic that I told you guys about in last week's stash video about going out and grabbing Mason Taylor while he was still lowly rostered and before this waiver period began. And they are looking to Mason Taylor. I mean, he had the most targets on this team in week 5 of the season, 12 targets compared to Garrett Wilson's 10 targets. You got to like where Mason Taylor is at right now. The Denver Broncos at home in week 6. The Broncos are still averaging about 10 fantasy points allowed to opposing tight ends on a regular basis. Just gave up a touchdown to Dallas Goedert this past week. So I like Mason Taylor in this matchup, even against a tough Broncos defense at the end of the day that could exploit the Jets and some of their weaknesses. Don't get me wrong. Still think Mason Taylor could be a solid start in week 6. And then he gets a really good matchup in week 7 against the Panthers, and then an even better matchup in week 8 against the Bengals. 2 teams in a row there that are very soft at the tight end position. So if you guys are hurting at tight end, Mason Taylor is a priority waiver wire add as we approach week 6 of the season. All right, and to wrap things up, let's talk about Theo Johnson of the New York Giants, sitting around just 10% rostered, 21.3 fantasy points in week 5 against the Saints. 7 targets, 6 catches, and 2 receiving touchdowns. He now has 3 receiving touchdowns in the last 2 games. And what we want to look at here is that the starting quarterback the last 2 games has been Jackson Dart, right? And with no Malik Neighbors in the mix, things have opened up here for Theo Johnson, and he seems to have really good chemistry with Jackson Dart in his rookie season. And we look like across at the wide receiver position. I mean, Darius Slayton got a little bit banged up with a hamstring injury. Rondell Robinson had just 5 catches for 30 receiving yards. There's not a lot going on at the wide receiver position in terms of production. So Theo Johnson could really move into a very formidable role with the Giants in terms of his pass catching and being a security blanket for Jackson Dart, especially if that chemistry is already developing. Now, it's a little bit of a tough stretch here. I don't want to just look at the tight end position specifically here, but just overall, this is a tough stretch. Philly, Denver, Philly, San Francisco. I'm a little bit worried there. And then they get Chicago on the road, not too worried there. Then they have Green Bay and Detroit. Like overall, this is a tough stretch for the Giants. We could see some lower impact games in terms of potential upside, but we could also see games where the Giants are absolutely forced to throw the football. Maybe we still get involvement. And once again, if Theo Johnson's going to be the guy leading the team in targets, or at least tying the team for targets like he tied Robinson this past week in week 5, he's absolutely going to be fantasy relevant. So once again, if you guys are struggling at the tight end position, Theo Johnson is a name that you guys can take a strong look at as we approach week 6 of the season. And there you guys have it. There are my 2 players to add at every single position as we move into week 6 of the fantasy season off of the waiver wire. If you guys need anything whatsoever as we move into week 6, be sure to drop your fantasy questions down below. I'll answer as many comments on this video as I can throughout the week. And while you guys are down there, it does me a huge favor if you guys hit that subscribe button and that like button on the way out. Really helps out the channel tremendously. And when the videos and playlists and all that stuff pop up on the screen, make sure you guys go check out all of our videos as the week begins to progress. We're going to have everything that you could possibly need to dominate week 6 of the fantasy season. And with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.